Hi, my name is David Bruce. I'm a composer. Thank you so much for watching. We all do things that you might describe as being stuck in a rut. Things that you do just because that's what you do, or because that's what everyone else does. I guess every tradition has its own ruts. Well, I suppose you could actually define a tradition as a collection of habits or ways of doing things. But I've always really enjoyed exploring other musical traditions outside of classical music precisely because they can open your eyes to ways of playing, practicing, and thinking about music that just don't occur to you from within the walls of your comfortable rut. Some of the most inspiring musicians I've worked with, like the players in the Silk Road Ensemble for example, always keep their minds open to the fact that there's more than one possible way of doing things, and that the cross-pollination of ideas from different disciplines is really at the heart of creativity. So today I wanted to show you just a few of the playing techniques that exist in other traditions of music, but that for one reason or another have been banished from the typical classical musician's technique. And I'll give you a few examples of how I've tried to use them in my own compositions. What I find particularly exciting in the techniques I'll show you here, and others like them, is that they emerge from a place of genuine expressivity. But it's a form of expression that can sometimes feel uncomfortable or unfamiliar, and can end up being dismissed as something vulgar or amateurish. That's the resistance you feel as you approach the edges of a rut. And nowhere is this resistance more apparent than when it comes to vibrato. The wrong kind of vibrato seems to get people worked up almost more than any other musical technique. In particular, I think a wide vibrato is seen as quite sort of vulgar or crass, and it's something you almost never hear from classical musicians. So in my own piece, Piosenki, I used a wide vibrato on a horn line in imitation of Romanian brass bands. And I have to say it was literally shocking to hear that sound in a concert hall. I mean, this was my own subjective response, but I really felt like I'd never heard that sound in that environment before. But there's also been friction on the other side of the debate. The early music movement caused uproar when they started using much less vibrato back in the 80s. The style of vibrato you prefer seems to be almost as much of a personal choice as the style of music you like, and people get very upset when they hear something that doesn't match their preference. I first came up against this problem, this barrier that some musicians have, after I discovered Klezmer music, and it was Klezmer vibrato in particular that struck me as incredibly expressive. It's also, by the way, a style of vibrato that's associated with Dixieland jazz. Here's Johnny Dodds playing 47th Street Stomp. That kind of intense vibrato was just not something I'd ever heard a classical player produce. Most classical clarinetists will use very little vibrato, or if they do, they produce it by varying the air pressure from the lungs so the pitch is unchanged. The vibrato effect is produced by rapid small changes of volume. The typical pure classical sound is most familiar from pieces like Mozart's Clarinet Quintet, and it certainly has its own beauty. The Klezmer vibrato, however, is produced in the mouth in the embouchure, creating changes in the actual pitch. This is the great Klezmer pioneer Gyora Feidman, and if you look closely you can actually see his lower jaw moving in and out to create the vibrato. So I was very excited by this sound, but when I took it to a classical clarinetist, admittedly this was a good 20 or so years ago, she told me that this kind of vibrato was bad for your classical technique, and she straight out refused to play it. Happily, I've met a large number of clarinetists who are able to play both classical music to the highest level, but also this klezmer and trad jazz kind of vibrato. Partly spurred on, I think, by pieces like Osvaldo Golijov's The Dreams and Prayers of Isaac the Blind, this style of playing has become something many classical players are now more comfortable with. They just needed to break out of that vibrato rut that they were in. Now I regularly request this kind of vibrato from players, often just writing in the part klezmer vib. Here's an example from my piece Gumboots. It's worth noting that the same kind of vibrato can be used more intimately. Here's my friend David Orlowsky demonstrating. There's a whole lot more to say about vibrato and its ability to stir passionate, almost tribal emotions, but I wanted to move on to a couple more techniques. The next one we'll look at we'll call ghost notes, and again it's something that's found a lot in klezmer playing. A ghost note is a note that you finger on the instrument but you don't allow to fully speak. It's most common as a form of embellishment, and here's David Orlowsky again explaining that this once again has a real and expressive origin.
You take away the fingers really quickly at the end of the note and then put them back down, but you also take away almost all of the air, so it becomes kind of like a ghost note that it's very audible, but you can, yeah, it still has an effect. It sounds like this. And that really derives from the Yiddish language and from the way the people were singing this.
So this may be another example of the influence of language on music that I talked about in a previous video. Glottal stops are part of the Yiddish language, and this kind of ghost technique does seem closely related to that sound. The primary importance of pitch has been part of classical music for so long that the idea of not allowing a note you're playing to fully speak seems like an anathema. Try asking a violinist or a wind player to finger but not sound a particular note, and you'll often run into difficulty. But that doesn't stop me trying. When I use it, I tend to write it down as a note with a cross for a note head, and then I put a full explanation of what I'm after below. Connected to this in klezmer is the common practice of using wider intervals of grace note. I think most classical music uses just neighbouring notes for its ornaments, but klezmer uses a full range, and it almost seems like the wider the interval, the greater the expressive power. It's something related to a sob, I think. It's an effect I love using in my own music. The final example I want to give comes not from klezmer but from Indian music, and we're straight away confronted with an approach to thinking about music that's very different and quite profound in its implications. In Western classical music, we're used to thinking of notes as distinct individual points, particles of sound if you like, whereas in Indian classical music a note is almost permanently on the move. More of a wave than a particle if you want to get quantum about it. As a result, Indian music is incredibly rich in embellishments. Here's a fabulous book for musicians familiar with Western notation who want to explore Indian ornaments. It's called Indian Melodies by Candida, Connolly. It gives you written out examples and has a CD as well so you can play along and try to master the precise feel. One particular style of playing an ornament which I wanted to explore was a string technique where there's a continuous movement so that the player slides between notes using one finger. I attempted this in my piece The Eye of Night. There's no doubt it's a challenging thing for a Western player to achieve, and it's important to remember that the sounds you'll hear from an Indian musician have often been mastered over decades. Definitely the easiest approach would be to say, no, we Western players don't have the training to play such things, it would be foolish to try. But at the end of the day, and without wanting to get too polemical about it, I would say it's a question of what kind of person you prefer to be. Someone who sits comfortably within their confines and tradition and rejects other possibilities, or someone who's open, interested and willing to take on new challenges, even at the risk of failure. Thanks so much for watching. I'd love to hear from you if you can think of other ways of playing that exist in other cultures that don't very often get used in classical music, and particularly if you can think of ways that they can be notated. Do consider supporting the channel by joining my patrons over on Patreon. If you liked the video, do please like and subscribe and share with your friends, and I'll see you next time.